Hello. How are you all doing today? Enjoying your PyCon so far? All right, help me welcome Lady Red, aka Chris, to tell us more about medieval DSL.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Um, all right, so welcome to my talk, Medieval DSL. Just to clarify, this is about heraldry, and heraldry is the medieval swords and knights kind of thing. It's not like a new cloud platform like someone was guessing earlier. So yeah, yeah. So here's why we're here. This is the intersection of my two interests between gnarly medieval stuff and cool computer stuff. So I was able to get a talk out of that. Heraldry is interesting to me because it's this combination of graphic design, like medieval history, self-representation, and just like an absurd amount of rules. And we're going to get into some of the rules and some of the interesting programmatic things that they ended up doing in the Middle Ages that kind of predated a lot of what we have now. It's very interesting. So the original purpose of a coat of arms was to identify someone in battle when they're wearing full armor. So you want to know who to follow, who to kill. And they also provide family and state and personal identification in a society that's really obsessed with lineage and hierarchy. Yeah, and also after this talk, you're going to start seeing coats of arms everywhere. Wine bottles, cars, buildings, logos all over the place. This is essentially the logos of the Middle Ages. But one of the fundamental problems is now we have a logo. You see the Twitter logo at any point, it's going to be pixel perfect. It's going to be the exact same bird. But in the Middle Ages, there's no way to exactly copy an image from one thing to the other because there's no copiers or computers. It's just going to be a guy in a castle painting a shield. How can you define what is the actual canon information that's different than the artistic embellishment? So the answer is they actually boiled it down to a DSL called Blazon, which reads something like if XML were to marry French, were to marry English, you'd get something like this. All right. So let's just go into what we're looking at with the coat of arms. This is the coat of arms of the UK. And just to get some terminology out of the way, this top thing, this little line on top, that's the crest. So the whole thing is called a coat of arms or a heraldic achievement. People sometimes call just the top thing, or call the whole thing a crest, and that's wrong. The crest is only the little animal or symbol that appears on top of the helmet. Then there's a crown on this one. They don't always have crowns. There's a helmet. The style of the helmet determines the rank of the bearer. So does the style of the crown. So you could tell you if you're nobility or if you're a common person. Then mantling usually reflects the colors of the crest or of the coat of arms. We got these supporters, which are these animals that hold up the side. And then there's this order around it. So most achievements don't have all of these things. Just the coat of arms of the UK has almost every single thing because they kind of invented heraldry. So the coat of arms are called the escutcheon. That's the shield itself. There's also a compartment at the bottom and a motto. So that's just the full thing. And all of that, this is like an SVG I got from Wikipedia. And this isn't, this is the coat of arms of the UK, but in a more fundamental way, this is the coat of arms of the UK. This is the Blazon representation of what we just saw. So if you read it, it's crazy. It's a lot of words you don't know. What's ghouls? And then it's just it's hard to parse what's going on. There's a lot of of words that aren't even in English or French or whatever. So we're gonna go into how to parse this. At the end of this talk, we're gonna successfully parse that. All right, a couple other things about coats of arms as we're getting started. Arms are inheritable, but usually the way land is inheritable, not the way a name is. So if you find out my name is Smith, is there a coat of arms for someone named Smith? That doesn't mean it's your coat of arms. You have to have been the first son of the first son of the first son of the first son of that guy to inherit it. Although that's different from country to country and across time. And I'm calling this medieval DSL because it's amazingly consistent. But given the fact that it was written over 500 years, I mean, Python's what, like 30 years old? And you know, how many different versions have we had? But this is a language that's been written for 500 years. In the High Middle Ages, by groups that were constantly at war with each other. So it's been simplified. Okay, so let's look at some Blazon. Azure, so all of the colors are really formalized. There's only 7 colors, and Azure is the word for blue. So this one I'm actually going to try and, I'm trying to describe the Blazon for the Python logo. Because I was looking at it and I said, hey, that's actually heraldic, we could describe it. So we have 2 serpents. I'm calling them serpents because it looks like in the Middle Ages, Python meant like a wyvern-like creature, but a serpent was like reliably a snake. And then we have to describe the position of the serpents. So I was kind of going into that. Here's a bunch of different words for positioning of animals. So I went with erect as the rough shape of the serpent, and also that they're kind of combined against each other, dorsed on the other side. That they're combined but facing away from each other. And then they're also intertwining each other. And then here's an interesting thing. Of the field and or, the sinister inverted. So of the field means it's the color of the field. So in Blazon, you actually can have like references to other parts of the same shield. So when you say of the field, Azure is the color of the field. So it's kind of like a reference to, like a variable reference. Or is the color for gold, and then I'm saying the sinister one is inverted. And you might say like, wait, doesn't sinister mean left? The right one's inverted. That's because the coat of arms, you always imagine someone is holding it. So the, like holding the shield. So it's the left side or the right side of the guy holding the shield, not of anyone looking at it. So there's a lot of gotchas and little edge cases in this, and you can really just go forever. All right. So let's try and build a parser for this. If you start looking into Python parsers, you'll find that there's more than you can count. I decided to go with Lark. Most of the parsers support similar rules that are all in Bacchus Nauer form. And so you can kind of take one rule set and go from parser to parser. But I decided to use Lark because it's got good documentation, and it's got a couple different parsers in there that like under the hood that you can switch between. So let's look at just like this introduction to this parser. Let's try and parse hello world. So if you've written regexes before, parser is like regexes on steroids. So hopefully you like regexes because it's going to be a lot of that. Here I'm saying for this hello world, lowercase letter, uppercase letter, defining both of those cases, and then you can say a letter itself is either uppercase or lowercase, and then a word is many letters. So that's sort of familiar syntax if you've seen regexes before. And then I'll define my start rule as a word, a comma, a word, and then an exclamation mark. So I'm able to parse hello world and get out what is actually called an abstract parse tree. So that's like a way of taking text and taking into a symbolic representation of that. All right, so let's start building this for Blazon. As I said, there's only 7 colors, 5 colors and 2 metals. So that's easy because those are all going to be keywords. So I'm just going to define all of those. And then I'll be able to say that tincture is metal or color. Tincture is the rule for the combination of those 2 things. And the lowercase indicates that it's like that it's not. So if it's uppercase rule, that means it's like a leaf node. It only has keywords in it. But if it's lowercase rule, that means it's like just a node in the middle of the graph. So that's just useful to understand. All right, so now immediately we're already able to understand these 2 coats of arms, which are very simple, but they're real coats of arms that people have. there's a little bit of a like name grab, domain squatting thing going on with coats of arms, where the guy who got blue, like everyone, is like, yeah. uh, yeah. So then let's look at some more. We actually have some like patterns that are like a nice step up in complexity. So here's two, ermine and ver. Ermine is symbolized. You guys know like a picture of a king, and he's got like a white fur with little black dots on it. It's like it's a very luxurious fur, so that's ermine. And then ver is, I think, symbolized like squirrel fur. But what's interesting about these is not only are they just those things, they actually kind of are like functions. They can take arguments. So here's or, ermine, ghouls, and this is the next one's very, or, and purple. So it's interesting that the ermine one is kind of infix, and then the very one is kind of prefix, and they're like pretty consistent about that. So we can put that into our parser. So for our fur parser, it could be ermine, ver, or a fur and then two tinctures. Or it could be a tincture, a fur that goes as an infix fur, and then another tincture. So we can have ermine or very as a fur, and we can kind of define the way that it can take it can include other rules inside of it. And then we can redefine our tincture rule to include metal, colors, or furs. Okay. So then these are kind of the base cases that we'll start with arms. Arms are right now just a single field, and a field's just a single color. So that's kind of the full rule set. So now I'm able to, with this rule set, parse this, very, or, and ghouls. And as you can see, we have this heraldic abstract syntax tree that gives me like a understanding in code of what this thing is. And when I built a giant database of a ton of coat of arms, and I was running it against this as I was writing these, and I would like add a rule set, run it again, and see I got like 2% more coats of arms, of the 100,000 I had indexed. So that was a fun way of building this. All right, so let's go on for more complexity. Ordinaries are the names for geometric shapes. And then we also have, so these are the main ones, the most honorable ordinaries. And then here's the ones that aren't as honorable, but show up still sometimes. And there's a lot of them. You can kind of, the real way to get this list is just to look at a really old book. But you keep on finding that, like, oh, in South Africa they have additional subordinary that doesn't appear anywhere else. But so a lot of this has been adding on to these lists of keywords. But yeah, some of these are really interesting. Like you might notice that there's a escutcheon or escutcheon is a mini shield subordinary. That one and a canton, they both often have an entire coat of arms on top of them. So these things are like fully recursive. Yeah. So let's see. So now we can parse these ones: Azure, Abend, Very, or in Ghoul. So I'm not going to read all of them, but you can see that it's got a bend on it, and then the bend has its own pattern. So there's kind of there's ordinaries that have their own tinctures, and you can start to have ordinaries that have ordinaries on them. So there's stars on a stripe, and then this one over here, there's saltire with diamonds on it with a dot on that. So it's like 3 layers deep of dependent clauses. Yeah, so let's talk about how we can do these like groups of things on things. I make this ordinary charge, which has got like a number, then the tincture, and then the number of ordinaries. And then I make this charge group rule, which has got that it could be 2, charge group and charge group, or charge group on and then another subgroup, or on a charge group, a subgroup. Sometimes Blazon has the Yoda thing where they say like, on this, do a this, So just covering both those cases. So then our arms is now a field, or a field and some charges, or just some charges. And then that makes us able to parse this thing, which means we're scaling up in complexity pretty quickly. So this is the arms of the Duke of Braganza, and as you can see, it's pretty complicated Blazon, but it's all ordinaries, and we're able to say this charge group, and then recursively another charge group of 5 escutcheons, and then on top of each of that, there's 5 Blazons. So we're able to parse this whole thing. All right. Next, and the next thing I have to tackle is, of course, animals and other objects like that. In the Middle Ages, they knew about a lot of more animals that we don't know, like, for instance, sea lions at the bottom. Yeah, so this one you can really just spend a long time finding out new animals that they invent. You know, there are some that only ever appear on a single coat of arms. Like there's like 6 coat of arms that have elephants on them. So I found that out and added it to my list. This is a very small subset, but you can just see that this is basically just lists of a ton of keywords. And then animals have a special modifier that can happen to them where they have a position. So like whether a lion is roaring or crouching or looking at you and crouching, that's like actually defined. But also like that's defined here, but if the artist were to draw the lion and you know, maybe the tail is going in a different direction, that's not defined. So you know, there's like a thing where people would recognize that, you know, certain element here is part of the actual coat of arms and part of it is just artistic license. So, but it gets down to this much detail. So there's a lot of different positions of animals, and there's like certain things that only certain animals can do. So it gets pretty complex. For instance, only the peacock can be in his pride, which is my favorite. This is the peacock with the full tails, because only the peacock has a tail that can do that. So yeah. Anyways, these are mostly just a big list of keywords that I then add, but then also sometimes they can be multiple different attitudes that they can have. So then, yeah, so that's animals. And then the next challenge is quartering. So as I said, these things are fully recursive. They actually did recursive coats of arms very frequently. Whenever you would inherit from 2 different families that both had arms, then you'd get to quarter. So like here, the simplest one is the princely house of Hohenzollern, which is quarterly, sable, and ghoul. So that's, you can actually see each of those sable and ghouls. That's a complete coat of arms, and then they're quartered together. Another great one is Castile y Leon, which has a castle and a lion, because sometimes they were clever like that. And what's interesting about this is that the actual emblazonment of the arms of Castile y Leon is quarterly 1 and 4 Castile, 2 and 3 Leon, which means that they like reference them by reference, that you'd have to know what Castile looked like. And so I've included those beneath so you can understand it. But yeah, they have like references to whole other coats of arms you'd have to go look up and then paint that one on. So that, you know, that was usually for like state level stuff that you'd be like, I'd have, you know, old France on a canton or something like that. So that's interesting that they can also reference other coats of arms. And here's the coats of arms of the entire EU. So yeah, it can get very complex. But because of the way we've kind of built this, it's not very hard to extend our thing to be able to parse this. So I can say quarterly of a certain number, and then have so this quarter group kind of just repeat. So like, you know, quarterly, then 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, separated by like and or something like that. And that's included in the rules. So because it's recursion, it's easy to just use the same thing multiple times. So that actually is all we need to parse the coat of arms of the UK. just going over this, it's a quartered one. So we're going to have three separate quarters. The first one is for England. That's 3 lions, passant, gardent, arranged along an ordinary of a vertical. And then it has the colors that they are. And then the second quarter is a lion rampant inside of an ordinary, which is the border. And then the third one is a harp. That's or stringed argent, so it's got white strings. And yeah, that's actually we're able to fully parse this whole thing, which I think seemed very daunting at first. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of the obscure rules. One of the most important ones is the rule of tincture, which is that only certain coats of arms are valid. So if we look at this one, which is sable with a bend gules, which is this red stripe on the black, that is not valid. Any herald would spit at you if you tried to ask for that. But this one with a yellow stripe, that's totally valid. So that's because it's a metal on a tincture. They had some rules that kind of were to enhance contrast. And you can have a color on a metal or a metal on a color, but you couldn't do metal on metal or color on color. Yeah, with the exception of Jerusalem. Jerusalem could do color on color, or metal on metal because it's very resplendent. Anyway, so the trouble with this is it becomes, certain countries care about it more than others. And also, it starts to get very complex with like what happens when charges go from one to the other. And you also might not want to just refuse to parse one that's wrong. You might want to parse it and then handle it in some other case. Be like, hey, technically this is wrong, but still have understood it. So this is why I'm saying that when you get to like these more complicated rules, like the rule of tincture, it's too complicated for a parser. So that would be the kind of thing that you would check in a validation step. So here would be like if you wanted to go from Blazons to full coat of arm renders, this is what you would do. And I've actually only done this part, the parsing, for this talk, just to keep it simple, because I'm sure drawing the shields is its whole own bag of worms. But yeah, so we've built this whole abstract syntax tree just from the Blazon, which is getting to the point of why this is at PyCon. So now that you've seen all of this, you're fully qualified to read the Python grammar. It's actually shorter than the grammar I wrote for Blazon. So this is your homework, by the way. Enter it in your phone at some point, like next week when you're back in your regular life, to just Google Python grammar and read this. I mean, let's look at some of these things. That this defines an if statement. If, then there's a test, colon, then there's a suite that it's supposed to do, and then there's an optional elif, and there could be multiple, and then there's a optional else, and then here's a while statement, which is even simpler than the if. So hopefully now that you've seen these parsing and you've seen the medieval contexts, you can see this is actually very simple compared to the heraldic one. And I think that really everyone who's using Python ought to read the grammar, because there's kind of like there's a difference between like knowing what things you can do and what things work, but then it's also a difference between like understanding why it works, and kind of going to the source of figuring out like how is this language actually processed, and taking away the magic there. So I mean, I'm just taking some samples of how the Boolean logic works, where the or can take an and, or, you see what I mean? They're kind of nesting and calling each other. Here's like a statement is either a simple or a compound statement. For a simple statement, it could be one of these import lines, a global assert lines, or it could be like a compound statement that's like a whole block. But yeah, I'm not going to explain the whole Python grammar right now because it's your homework. Great. So here's me also parsing a print statement in the same thing. Any questions? Thanks.
We have about 5 minutes for questions, so please feel free to approach the mic and ask questions.
Oh, also, does anyone in the audience have a coat of arms? I'm always curious. Just shout out if you have one, because I'd be interested. Yeah. Cool. It's relevant to one person.
Hi, I was wondering if you said you built a database of all the coat of arms you could find.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if, like, did you have any idea of how many permutations there were with this language?
You mean how many total things are in my database?
I guess it's a two-part question. How many things are in your database, and how many things are theoretically possible?
Oh, infinite.
Okay.
I mean, it's recursive, right? So you could always be like, take all the ones that are theoretically possible, put that in the corner, and then multiply it by, them again. So it's easily provable to be infinite. And I have about 150,000 in my database, but like I mostly have like 2 or 3 sources that was like most of Europe in like the 1850s. Right. But there's a lot of more like coat of arms that I haven't even included, because after 150,000, I felt like I had enough,
Really quickly, was there a limit to the amount of recursion?
Like how deep it could go? There's no limit in the language. The most number of quarterings I think they've ever seen is 719 quarterings. So, yeah, there's a lot of inbreeding. So sometimes you get the same one showing up a bunch of times. You're like, huh, it's a lot of that one lion coming back.
Hi. So I was wondering if the language also describes how to find out the rank from the crown.
Sorry, what was that?
The rank from the crown.
What? Sorry.
The rank of the bearer, king, prince, viscount.
Oh, the rank. Yeah. So the rank is determined by the crown. Yeah, so that would tell you if you were an earl or a duke or whatever. And I mean, everyone's trying to improve their status. It's not on the actual shield itself, because I guess hopefully it changes a lot. Yeah. But yeah, it's on the full achievement that you'd be able to tell. And I think that if you were a nobility in a country, you would know almost everyone else's coat of arms, who's of the, in their hierarchy by sight.
Yeah, and also I was wondering if the database is available somewhere for us to play around with, if possible.
The database is what? Is it online?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on my GitHub. So I'm MC Scope on GitHub, and I published it. I don't know if it was okay to publish it, but most of the stuff I got from like a book from the 18th century. So I think that's probably public domain. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, awesome talk. So has any work been done on trying to automatically render these things from the parse description?
Yeah. So I didn't cover that for this talk because I felt like I had enough just in parsing it. But this website, drawshield.net, you're able to type in a Blazon and they'll render it for you.
Oh, sweet. Didn't see that. Okay.
Yeah, so that's awesome. That's a great source to know heraldry. Also, I really recommend Reddit's our heraldry community. And also, I recommend really old books about it, because there's a lot of resources on Gutenberg. Yeah.
2 questions. What percentage of your database did you end up being able to successfully parse?
Yeah, I maxed out at around 70%. And then it started being, there's a lot of like, things that only ever appear in this individual, like long tail, It's like, oh, they invented a new kind of bird that lived in this guy's hometown, and that appears on there. It's like, yeah, so there's a lot of long tail things, but yeah, 70% is what I maxed out at, which I thought was good. I mean, given that this thing, I did this in, like a week or 2,
That's
and
real good.
they wrote it over for 500 years,
Yeah, that's great. Good job. Also, where do you find these old books?
Yeah, so a lot of them are on like Project Gutenberg or stuff like that. But I actually got linked to them. So from like JawShield or Wikipedia, I got linked to these books from there. Really, JawShield's an awesome resource. They have a lot of they have not only can they render the coat of arms, but they have a lot of like information about heraldry too. So yeah.
Did you find that the order of things describing objects on the shield, if that makes sense, matches the order that I sometimes run into online where they talk about the adjective order that people expect in English? Did you find that some of the language you were seeing resembled language that's used today, or can you talk about that a little?
It definitely doesn't parse like natural, when you're seeing it. There's a lot of times where it's a little bit ambiguous where exactly something will be, because they only really had commas. They didn't use like parentheses to separate whole blocks. So sometimes so one thing that Reddit's heraldry community does, which is really interesting, is they do a telephone game where they'll have someone draw a shield and then someone take the shield and write the description, and then someone takes the description and then draws the shield again. And you kind of run into these issues where like it can be really ambiguous. You know, like is this charge supposed to appear like at the top of the area we're currently in, or at the top of the whole thing, or at the bottom? You know, and so some of that is like a little bit of ambiguity that's just kind of built into the language. And then, yeah, the way things like adjective orders, sometimes you see them where they're like kind of like on a blank, which is not really how you would say it in English. You'd say there's a blank on a blank. You kind of would do infix, but instead they have like a prefix thing. So, and I think part of that is because it like partially comes from French. I don't really understand why. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have one question. What prompted you to be interested in this?
Well, as I said, it's got a ton of rules, and I think that's really interesting to my mind. It's also something that I felt like there's a programming talk in there, and I could talk about Middle Ages stuff. So that was very appealing to me. I had this idea for this talk last year at PyCon, and then I just kind of had this inspiration that, hey, I could actually get on stage and give a talk. So if you're here in the audience, consider submitting a talk. Like if you're here, you're qualified to talk, and you should try it.
Please help me thank Lady Red.